one of my big hopes is that the project would be used by teachers and students to learn about soldiers that went to war and served and sacrificed, and so that they are remembered. The project itself began quite by accident back about 10 years ago, when I happened to be at Sarnia Collegiate, and I was there for a meeting, and I happened to notice that outside, why is my slides not moving?
Try clicking, Tom, in the bottom left corner. There's 2 arrows when you move.
Yes.
Try clicking the over arrow, see if that works.
There we go. Okay, thanks. Sorry. Technology is going to get me. I'm old. Outside the main office at Skits was this plaque, and it caught my attention. And on it are the names of 111 former students that went to Sarnia Collegiate, that went and served in World War II and didn't come home. Now, I was working at St. Patrick's High School at the time, and I knew that during World War II and the Korean War, there were only 2 high schools in Sarnia, Sarnia Collegiate and St. Pat's. So I figured there had to have been some kids at St. Pat's that went to war. And so that was kind of the initial goal. I thought, I'm going to see if I can get some sort of a plaque created for St. Pat's, similar to the one at Skits. I just felt it was important that students learn that young people not much older than themselves signed up to go to war voluntarily and left for overseas, and some of them didn't make it home. So that was the goal. It was to get a plaque for St. Pat's. I figured it'd be fairly easy. I would just get a list of the names of Sarnia's veteran and fallen soldiers. Veterans are the ones that went to war and came home. Fallen soldiers are the ones that went to war and didn't come home. So I thought, oh, this would be fairly easy. Get the list of the names, match them up with school records, easy peasy. So where do you find a list of names of Sarnia's veteran and fallen soldiers? These are some of the sources that I started with. And I was having difficulty finding information. And it turns out that there was no record of Sarnia's, certainly of veteran soldiers, but there wasn't even a true record of Sarnia's fallen soldiers. The only record that existed is right there, the Sarnia Cenotaph. And if you look at the Sarnia Cenotaph closely, do you notice anything about the names? Last names, surnames with an initial or 2, and that's it. That was Sarnia's only record of its fallen soldiers. So I kind of reset my goal and thought, I'm going to see if I can find out who these people were, get as much information about each of them as I can, and then donate it all to schools, libraries, museums. So that's how it started. Now, so at least I had some surnames. But again, where do you go from there? I've got surnames, but from the cenotaph. And so again, a variety of sources for information. And some of the challenges that existed. For example, the surname Jones, pretty common surname. Do you know how many Jones served in World War II? How do I find out which Jones is from Sarnia? Microfilm was always a challenge. Ages, not matching records. I'd find birth records of a soldier, but their birth dates didn't match up with birth dates that were given in military records, military websites. And one that I wasn't expecting was errors with the cenotaph itself. This is something I didn't realize existed. But right across Canada, many of the cenotaphs contain spelling errors or are missing names. And I'll use the Sarnia cenotaph as the example. That was the original cenotaph as it was unveiled in 1921. It had a couple plaques front and back with Sarnia citizens that served, but on the left-hand side, as you see it, left-hand side, there was a plaque with 60 fallen soldiers from Sarnia Lambton that didn't come home. Now, where did those names come from? Sarnia-like communities across country. Those names were gathered by volunteers, usually after the war, usually family members or veterans groups. They would collect these names. And so names were missed or misspelled. Example, if let's say a guy came here to work in Sarnia Lambton and then but had no family here, and over the course of 3 years gets forgotten. In fact, so the cenotaph was unveiled in 21. 1 year later, they added the soldier on top. That's not there in this picture, but they added another plaque, and guess how many names they added? They added another 42 names, 42 fallen names. So they missed 42 names they collected in 1 year. After World War II, it was 10 years after World War II that they were able to complete their list of names and put them on. They added those wings to the cenotaph with the names. So years of research, 2013, I released my initial findings. There was an updated version released in 2014. And then I continued my research, was able to make contact with more family members of fallen soldiers. And one of the big ones was a new source of information became available through Library and Archives Canada. And this is a page from their website in the military section, and there's just a plethora of information there. But one of the big ones was with the First World War. After 2014, Library and Archives Canada began the process of digitizing and making available all of the personnel records of Canadian soldiers that fought in World War I. So that's huge. Now I could access personnel files. For World War II service files, they started to become available through Ancestry. So when you go through personnel files, you come across lots of neat information. For example, this is one of Sarnia's fallen soldiers from World War I. This is his attestation paper. So this is what he would have signed up to go to war. I was thought part of the morbid part of this was not only do they ask next of kin, they also, there's a little box where you fill in if you've got any distinguishing marks like scars or tattoos. There's a kind of a morbid aspect to that. You can probably guess as to why they want to know that. And this is the form that they're signing up to go to war. Through the archives, you can come across Battalion Diaries. So if you know a soldier's battalion, you can kind of trace where he is and what they were doing. This is a circumstances of death register. These cards would have been filled in shortly after a soldier's death. This is one of Sarnia's fallen soldiers from World War I, and it gives some basic details on maybe where and how the soldier was killed and where he was buried. Telegrams are always kind of heart-tugging. This is an example of a telegram received by a local mom informing her that her son was killed in World War II, and that's all they got. So traditionally there were bike messengers that would deliver these to the home of the family, and that's all they got, that little bit of news, very few details. Shortly thereafter, they would get a letter. Again, limited details. This is again another letter received by a mother from a World War I soldier. Very few details, but it gave them a little bit more information that said, your son's passed away. So altogether, it was close to 10 years of research to complete these books. And just this spring, they were released. I had a couple of former colleagues, Lou Giancarlo and Tom Slater were instrumental in helping go through the information and edit and help write the information. The 4 groups on the right-hand side there, they funded the printing of copies of the book. So there was 80 or so copies of this 2-volume set were printed. And all those books were donated throughout the community, through the city, through the county, to libraries, archives, museums. All the high schools should have them, military service clubs, senior residences, all have the book. The book has been donated. The book is also made available online free. All of the information is there through any of those 4 websites. Inside the book, there's lots of information, and again, especially for teachers and students. And most important, the focus is local. And I feel it's important that students are made aware that whenever Canada went to war, Sarnia Lambton went to war. Ordinary citizens volunteered and served overseas in wars. Many of them made the supreme sacrifice. Many more returned and died soon after the war, or they lived with the physical and mental wounds that war left behind. From the very first time Canada sent troops overseas to fight in a war, Sarnia Lambton soldiers went and died. Only 3 months after Sarnia became a city, World War I would start, and Sarnia citizens would volunteer and serve. These are local troops leaving Ferry Dock Hill. These are some of the famous battles from World War I that Canada fought in. And every single one of these famous battles, Sarnia Lambton citizens fought and died. So they endured the trenches, the mud, the artillery, the machine guns, the barbed wire. And when the war ended, over 112 Sarnia Lambton citizens made the supreme sacrifice. Only 20 years after the end of World War I, the Second World War would begin. And again, local citizens volunteered and marched off to war. Following the key campaigns that Canada was involved in, and again, in all of these, Sarnia Lambton kids served and died. So whether it was in the air, on the water, in the mountains, the valleys, liberating villages and towns, Sarnians were served in all of these campaigns. And when the war ended in 1945, approximately 170 Sarnia citizens made the supreme sacrifice in what was then called a young man's war. And that's bared out in that almost 40% of Sarnia's soldiers enlisted. They were still as teenagers. 5 years after that war ended, the Korea War would begin. And again, Sarnia citizens volunteered, served, and died in the hills of Korea. Since 1956, Canada was a leading nation in peacekeeping missions around the world. And again, Sarnia Lambton kids, citizens, served and died. And most recently, in Canada's longest war, Sarnia Lambton citizens served and died. Now, so that's a little bit about the project. Now, a couple of the stories, just to give you a taste of the sort of things that I came across. The Graham WR, as it's inscribed on the cenotaph, is from World War II. Early in my research, I came across this grainy photo of a man, a soldier holding a little baby. And it turns out that that little baby is his 1-month-old daughter, Susan. The photo was taken in October of 44. He had been overseas already and he'd returned back to Canada when this photo was taken. I also came across this letter that was that William had wrote, and he wrote this letter 3 months after that photo had been taken. So when he was back overseas, and it was kind of neat in that he wrote the letter to his then 5-month-old daughter, Susan, and his wife would have received the letter, and part of it reads in portion.
My dear little Susan, I wonder if this is the first letter you received. Anyway, I hope I shall be able to write you when you are older. Your father is very proud of you. I must thank you very much for the beautiful looking package we have just received from you. Your little ladyship showed wonderful discrimination in your choice of your gift. In photographs I have received of your bonny self just quite justify your father's pride in you. Give your love to your mothers, Mrs. Graham, and your Aunt Marie, and of course to your grandma, and love to you, Susan.
So early in the research, I came discovering this photo, and that letter kind of really got to me. I obviously wanted to find out more about William, his story. I was to learn that William had 2 other brothers, and all 3 of the brothers would serve in the war. William was the one on the left there, and he's the oldest of the 3. The family was originally from Windsor, but would make their way to Sarnia. They would live on Vital Street for a while before moving to London Road. And 1 week after the Second World War broke out, William and the next brother, Jack, would join the army together in Windsor. Those were the ages when they joined, and they both became members of the Essex Scottish Regiment. There's a photograph of Jack in his Scottish Regiment regalia. And so William and Jack joined together. They would train for a while in Windsor, and then they would embark overseas, where they would train in England. And they would train in England for almost 2 years. And it was August of 42, in a letter that Jack wrote, the middle son Jack wrote home to his parents. He told his parents that they were, quote, preparing for a big scale raid on the French coast, end of quote. And he also wrote that, quote, a certain somebody in England he met whom he liked very much. So brothers William and Jack Graham would cross the English Channel together on the way to France. And this was now they were going to see their first bit of action against the enemy. This is where they landed on August 19th, 1942. The landing, they arrived late. The enemy had already been alerted. And so they came on shore in full daylight, the enemy viewing them from atop cliffs. And it was days later, the grandparents in town here would get the news that Jack was missing in the raid, and there was no word on William's fate. The Dieppe raid was a complete disaster for Canada, for the 5,000 Canadians that took part. And 4 months after the raid, the grandparents here in Sarnia would learn the news that Jack was a prisoner of the Nazis. Jack Graham would be a prisoner of war for almost 3 years, spent time in several POW camps. He would lose over 100 pounds, but he did survive the war. And he was liberated in April of 1945. After returning from the prisoner of war camps, they returned to England. And upon arrival in England, that certain somebody whom he liked very much met him at the train platform. That somebody was Doris Durrell, who had actually served with the RAF during the war. So Jack and Doris married in England, and Jack and his war bride would return to Sarnia. Jack would work at Dow Chemical. Jack and Doris would have 3 children together, plus as the years went on, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Jack never spoke of the war, like most veterans, not to his children, not to his wife. And it wasn't until the early 2000s when one of his great-grandchildren, who was given assignment to write about his hero, that child picked Jack. And so Jack began to open up a bit about his experiences. And he went on to talk to classes and church groups about his experiences in the war and as a POW. Reflecting on Dieppe, Jack wrote the following, quote, we had plenty of training under our belt, and that training took over. We had practiced landing. However, the ramp went down and I found myself crawling over bodies. No training could prepare us for what lay ahead. Carnage was everywhere. It was a massacre. Jack wore a poppy year round. Now, if I go back to the short days following the Dieppe raid, so back to August 1942, only days after that Dieppe raid, this is a newspaper clipping from the Sarnia Observer, and you can see the youngest of the 3 Graham boys now decides he wants to go to war. So imagine being a parent. Lloyd Graham, the youngest, he had gone to elementary and school in South Sarnia, attended skits. He was active in sports, like machine shop at school. He was into building models. He was actually just started work with a tool company when he joined, and he joined the Air Force, not like the Army, like his brothers. So he was training to begin in Canada, and he would complete his training, Air Force training overseas in April of 44. And he became a pilot officer with Bomber Command. And so he was be part of a crew of one of these big 4-engine heavy Lancaster bombers. And he would serve overseas on a number of missions, and he would be overseas for about 8 months. On the night of December 6th, 7th, 1944, It was a night mission. His Lancaster and 450 others took off for a mission targeting a city in Germany. It was horrible stormy weather. There were freezing conditions. There was severe icing. They went anyway. And after taking off, Lloyd Graham's Lancaster was not heard from again. The aircraft was later recorded as failed to return to base. This is a telegram that the local chaplain received a few days after. And the chaplain was told, listen, you got to go tell the grandparents what happened. And the telegram portion reads, Lloyd Graham is reported missing after air operations overseas. Letter follows. So that's all the information you get. A letter would follow shortly, not long after, from a squadron commander who would just add in that there's still a possibility that all or part of the crew may be prisoners of war. It was not until 2 months after the war ended that the parents were informed that, for official purposes, Lloyd Graham is presumed dead. This is a letter, and if you look at the date, this is 6 years after the war is over. And this letter is sent to the Graham parents, and a portion of it reads, owing to the lapse of time and lack of information concerning your son, it's officially recorded that your son and his crew lost their lives and do not have a known grave. So the aircraft, the bodies of the 7 crewmen were never recovered. So Lloyd Graham doesn't have a grave. His name is engraved on the Runnymede Memorial in England, along with, in fact, 20 other Sarnians have their name engraved on that memorial. Now, if I go back to William Graham, remember William was the one that started all this. William, the oldest of the 3 boys, again, as a kid, he grew up loving basketball, baseball, hockey. He had just started work with the dairy when he enlisted to join with his brother Jack. Remember, he and Jack joined the Essex Scottish in Windsor, went overseas to England, trained together, and landed at Dieppe. Well, William survived Dieppe and made it back to England. 6 months after the Dieppe raid, in a letter that he wrote home to his mother, he told her that, quote, I had difficulty trying to erase Dieppe from my memory and have lived the raid over and over again, repeatedly in my dreams. So Jack returned to England, and a little while later, he was returned back to Canada for further infantry training and officers training. And his commanding officers' comments about William reflected a lot about William's character. Their comments included things like he's reliable and inspires confidence. He displays excellent qualities of leadership. He's confident while in command, and he's well liked by his platoon. While in Canada, William also, in May of '43, married Dorothy Davies, whom he nicknamed Duty. And 16 months after they were married, they had their little baby girl, Susan. And again, recall that photo of William holding the 1-month-old Susan. 3 months after the birth of their daughter, on Christmas Day, 1944, William would return back overseas. So he'd return to England and eventually make his way back to the front lines. And while back overseas, William wrote a lot of letters home, almost every evening, to his wife and his daughter. And in those letters, he constantly expressed how much he loved his wife and his daughter, told them not to worry about him, and expressed how much he missed home. Now, this is a letter that he wrote in late February of 1944 from a location unknown. Turns out that location unknown is Germany. And here's how a portion of that letter reads.
My darling, I'm afraid my letters are going to be few and far between, dearest. I am kept pretty busy, but you can bet I'll do my best. I love you, Duty. If this is hard to read, darling, please excuse it. It is a little on the difficult side to write here. We are in a ruined house and the writing facilities have disappeared. I am struggling along on a rickety table by candlelight and sitting on a box. But I have to tell you, I love you, my dearest.
And the letter would continue.
How is our Susan? She is quite a young lady now, I bet. Sitting in her high chair and eating grown-up food. I'd sure like to see her. Does she miss her daddy? The little devil probably gurgles and chuckles away to herself and is completely ignorant of my existence. But I love her just the same. I'll certainly miss her too, darling. Have I told you that I love you yet, my own Duty? Well, I do, darling. more than you'll ever know. I'll certainly be glad when this is over, and I can say that with more fervor I can say that with more fervor than I ever thought possible. It will be so nice to settle down and live peaceful, normal lives again. I adore you, my own dear wife. So long for now, sweetheart. Take care of yourself and Susan. We'll all be together soon. Kiss Susan for me, darling. I love you, my duty, forever and ever.
6 days after writing that letter, on March 2nd, 1945, in the Hochwald Forest of Germany, while leading his platoon during an attack, William Graham was killed in action by a mortar. 4 days after he was killed, a letter arrived for him from duty. It had a couple of photographs in it, a photograph of a Christmas tree, another photograph of their little Susan, and news about their little pablometer, that is what he called her. And Duty finished the note by writing,
I love you with all my heart, and Susan and I will be waiting right here for you.
That letter was returned, stamped reported deceased, with a return to sender label on it. And 2 months later, the war in Europe would end. So it's a heartbreaking story. In the early 2000s, a Toronto newspaper was able to track down Susan in an interview and talk to her about what her life how her life turned out to be. Susan explained that she only knew her dad through her stories, but her mom often told her stories about her dad, how proud he was of Susan and how much he loved her and cherished her. And Dorothy would eventually get remarried, and she actually gave the wedding band that William had gave her to Susan. Susan would explain that though Dorothy was remarried, she never loved her second husband as in the same passionate way as she did her first husband, William. Even later in life, Dorothy would sometimes see the ring on Susan's hand and would break down in tears. Susan has told her own children that when she dies, she wants her ashes scattered on her dad's grave so that she can be with her father forever. All right, a second story is from World War I. The name is Beatty, R.A., as it is on the cenotaph. And his name is Robert Arthur Beatty. He was actually born in England, and the family moved to Sarnia in the early 1900s. He was the oldest kid in the family. He had 6 brothers and sisters. His father worked at the rail station here in town. This is a portion of Robert's attestation paper when he completed in October 1915 to go to World War I. And put an arrow there beside his birth date because he wrote down that he was born in 1898. In fact, he was born in 1901. So he lied about his age to get in. He made himself 3 years older than he actually was. So the military thought he was age 17 and a half, when in fact he was 14. When he enlisted, he also brought a letter with him, a letter that was written by his mother. That's her photo in the corner there. And the letter reads,
Dear Sir, this is to certify that I give consent for my son, Robert Beatty, to enlist in His Majesty's service. Blanche Beatty.
So the military rule was you had to be 18 years old to go serve overseas. Well, Robert, and you didn't have to prove your age, you just, whatever you wrote down. So turns out thousands of Canadian kids enlisted in the First World War and served overseas. Robert Beatty was one of them, going overseas as a 14-year-old. He became a member of the 70th Battalion. This was a battalion that was mobilized out of London, Ontario. So there was a lot of Sarnia Lambton citizens, kids, part of this. He's in the top left there. This is with his platoon members. In fact, when this battalion left for overseas, they left from London, left the train station in London. Hundreds of Sarnia Lambton family members were at the train station to cheer them off. And of course, there were a lot of tears. So Robert Beatty and the 70th Battalion embarked overseas in April of 1916 aboard that ship. They arrived in May of 1916, and initially Robert became a member of the Mounted Rifles Battalion, a cavalry unit. But very soon after, it converted to an infantry battalion, which was quite common then. Cavalry, they were kind of figuring out that horses don't work too good in the type of warfare that was happening. And in June of 1916, Robert Beatty would move with his battalion to France in the front line. So he would arrive in the trenches with the mud, the rats, the disease, the poison gas, the barbed wire, the stench of death and decaying bodies. And not long after arriving, the Battle of the Somme began. The Battle of the Somme is one of the most futile and bloody battles in all of history. On the first day alone of this battle, 19,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers were killed on one day. Robert Beatty was there. The second major offensive of the Battle of the Somme was the Battle of Fleur-Cassette. And here the battle was fought in your typical, stereotypical way that was fought then. A signal was given. The soldiers leaped out of trenches and ran across a devastated no man's land through barbed wire and enemy fire, resulting in a horrific slaughter, thousands killed and wounded every day. It was at Courcelette where tanks were used for their very first time in war. And it was also where the creeping barrage was used for the very first time. This being where your artillery shells would precede the troops and would advance, a slow advance forward towards the enemy into enemy fire. On September 15th, the first day of the Battle of Courcelette, Robert Beatty left the trenches with his platoon during an advance, and he was not seen from again. He was initially reported as wounded and missing in action. He was just 15 years old. This is a death card that was filled in shortly after Robert's death, and you can see it records him simply as previously reported missing, now for official purposes presumed to have died, Courcelette sector. Robert Beatty has no grave. His body was never recovered. His name is inscribed on the Canadian National Vimy Memorial in France. His name, along with over 11,000 other Canadians killed in France with no known grave. There's 28 Sarnia names on that Vimy Memorial. Robert Beatty, not only is he the youngest name on the Sarnia cenotaph, turns out he's, as of now, the youngest known name on the Vimy Memorial. O'Connor, PW. This is another story that I came across early in my research. His photo was beside the staff room at St. Patrick's High School when I was there. There was a photo of him and a little poem beside it. Patrick was born and raised in Sarnia. He'd attended OLM, St. Patrick's High School, went to St. Joseph's Parish. And he was from a family of 4 boys and 2 girls. And it turns out 3 of the boys would serve in World War II. That's Patrick in the middle there. He would serve in the Navy. And I want to mention Barry, the one on the right. He's the eldest of the 3 boys, or the 4 boys. And Barry O'Connor, again, like his brother, attended OLM, Skits, and St. Pat's. Growing up, he liked skating and hunting and boxing. He was working at Electro Autolite when he joined the Air Force. The family was living on Harkness Street. He enlisted in August of 1940, joining the RCAF. 10 months after he joined, he married the love of his life, Helen Hood, in Winnipeg. And 2 months after getting married, he embarked overseas. Barry O'Connor would serve with Bomber Command, initially flying in the Wellington 2-engine bombers. And the squadron he was with was actually a Pathfinder force. The Pathfinder crews were hand-picked elite, highly skilled pilots, navigators, because the Pathfinder force were the ones that spearheaded the bomber stream. So their job was to find the target, drop colored flares to let the bombers following know where the target was. So Barry O'Connor acted as a bomb aimer as well as the front gunner, completed many hazardous operations over enemy territory. In a letter home, after one mission, he wrote, quote, "I got direct hits on my target with bombs of a 4,000-pound size." And he also wrote that on the way back, they ran into enemy fighters. As a gunner in the front turret, he was able to shoot down one of the fighters before their own aircraft had to dive down to about treetop level to try to escape the other fighters. Barry O'Connor was later transferred to a different squadron where he was flying these Halifax, the big 4-engine bombers. And in late April of 1943, he was on his 24th mission. And after 25 missions, you get to go home. It was a night mission, and they were laying mines in the North Sea off the coast of Norway. It's something they called gardening. So the aircraft left at night. It didn't return. This is a portion of a letter that his wife Helen received 2 weeks after the aircraft disappeared. A portion of the letter reads,
The operation was generally successful, but unfortunately your husband's aircraft failed to return and nothing has since been heard from it. There is a hope that all or part of the crew may either be interned in neutral territory or may be prisoners of war in enemy hands.
Later, it was reported that the aircraft was in fact lost to enemy action and all 7 crew members were lost. And it was not till 9 months later that he was officially declared dead overseas. So Barry O'Connor has no grave. His name is also inscribed on the Runnymede Memorial in England. And if you go to OLM Cemetery, the O'Connor family stone, his name is included on that stone. Now, if I go back to Patrick O'Connor, he served in the Navy in World War II. He was 17 when he joined, and he would spend much of his time aboard the Gatineau. And he would serve in the Battle of the Atlantic on convoy duty, escorting merchant ships from the east coast of Canada to England and Ireland. The ship itself had a highly esteemed reputation. It was pretty well at sea all the time, escorting merchant ships, doing sub patrols, even shooting down V-1 rockets. Patrick was at sea when he learned that his older brother, Barry, was missing in action. Now, Patrick survived, so he served 4 years in the Navy. War was over, comes back to Sarnia, marries Vera Moore in October of 1946. Patrick and Vera had 2 children, a daughter and a son. And Patrick was working as a driver salesman for a local bakery here in town. The family was living on Oak Street. Now, meanwhile, on the other side of the world, after World War II, the end of the war, there was an agreement made where the Soviets would receive the Japanese surrender north of the 38th parallel. The Americans would receive the surrender south of the 38th parallel. So the country of Korea was essentially cut in half. You had a Russian communist regime in the north and a US-backed democratic state in the south. But after World War II, there was constant distrust, military tensions between the two sides. In June of 1950, 5 years after the end of World War II, that happened. The United Nations quickly condemned the attack and began the process of trying to defending the South. And about 5 weeks after this invasion, Prime Minister of Canada announced that they would recruit a force to serve in Korea. Now, Patrick just felt the need to join. He and his wife Vera discussed the decision to enlist. Vera was supportive of Patrick and did point out that, you know what, you've got 2 children now. You're our source of income. You've already served 4 years in World War II. And in fact, you lost a brother in World War II, but Patrick was insistent that somebody had to stop the communists. So just 2 weeks after the Prime Minister announced they were recruiting a force, Patrick packed up his bags and left to join the army. His family didn't even have cab fare to see him off to the train station, so they said their goodbyes at home. So Patrick O'Connor would become a member of the Royal Canadian Regiment. He was now 26 years old. His plan was to, after the war, return back to Sarnia and go to medical school. So in April of 1951, after training in the state of Washington, the Royal Canadian Regiment would set sail for spring and it would arrive in early May of 1951. They would spend only about a week getting acclimatized and doing some basic training in Korea because changes at the front were forcing them you had to get to action quickly. So in May of 1951, the Royal Canadian Regiment, Patrick O'Connor moved to the front lines. Patrick O'Connor, being 27 years old, was considered the old man of the platoon. Most of the other members of the platoon were still teenagers. Patrick always carried a notepad with him, and in quiet moments, he would write poems and stories and make drawings for his 2 kids, then 3 years old and an infant. and every note he signed off with "Love and kisses, Pat." In late May of 51, they advanced towards north of the 38th parallel, towards a hill known as Hill 467. Now, this was a key position held by Chinese forces who were dug in there. And in fact, the Chinese forces were observing the Canadians as they approached the hill. The Royal Canadian Regiment were being told they would have to assault that hill. The commanding officer, in his words, said, "You'll be covered first by artillery and then by aircraft. Nothing to it. Just go to the top of the hill and occupy it." So the early morning hours of May 30th, 1951, the RCRs began their assault up this steep, rocky cliff in a driving rainstorm. The promised artillery and air cover that was supposed to come didn't come. So the RCRs got halfway up the rocky, muddy-covered hill and were pinned down by enemy machine gun fire. Patrick O'Connor was able to successfully remove several of the guys in the chaos. The platoon radio operator was frantically sending messages back to headquarters saying, "Guys, we're in trouble here. We need some support." This is a sketch done by the platoon leader, Lieutenant Stickland. He drew this later about their situation. Shows the soldiers climbing up this hill, machine gun fire ricocheting everywhere, including off the radio set, and the major back at headquarters saying, move on, they're not firing now." These are Lieutenant Stickland's own words on what happened the day Patrick was killed.
On the day Pat was killed, my platoon was leading an attack on Hill 467. Halfway up the mountain, my forward section came under intense fire, which killed 2 and wounded 4 others. Pat came running up the hill with the stretcher over his shoulder and took cover beside me, ignoring the danger to himself in his desire to get to the wounded. After a few minutes, he said, "To hell with it, I'm going after my boys."
Those were the last words that Patrick were to speak. Later that evening, the RCRs would retreat off the top of the hill. 6 were killed, including Patrick O'Connor, and another 54 were wounded. Patrick O'Connor is buried in the UN cemetery in Busan, South Korea. One of his platoon commanders would say of Patrick, quote, "He died trying to save the lives of the men with him. In my opinion, he should have received the Victoria Cross. He was a completely selfless and dedicated soldier, as well as a wonderful human being." A few months after Patrick's death, his wife Vera would receive a letter from parents of one of the wounded soldiers that O'Connor got off the hill. And enclosed with the letter was a poem that Patrick had written for that soldier the night before the battle. A portion of that poem reads as follows.
Forward they marched into battle, with faces unsmiling and stern. They knew as they charged the hillside, there were some who would never return. Some thought of their wives and their mothers, some thought of their sweethearts so fair, and some they plotted and stumbled, were reverently whispering a prayer. There is blood on the hills of Korea. It's the gift of the freedom they love. May their names live in glory forever, and their souls rest in heaven above.
In November of 1952, the Remembrance Day ceremony, it was then called Victoria Park, now Veterans Park. The first wreath laid at the cenotaph was by Vera O'Connor and their 2 children, their daughter, age 5, and their son, age 3. So there are many stories in the Sarnia War Remembrance Project. Again, books are available at libraries, schools, museums. It's also available online. My big hope is that teachers and students will access it, use it as a resource to remember not only the soldiers, but also the families that sacrifice. And I'll end with this.